Chapter 16. Ashalia had fallen asleep in the cabin, finding the gentle hum of the Stral's engines bizarrely comforting, and had been eased into consciousness as they slowed while landing, eventually silencing completely, leaving a stagnant, empty feel to the ship. She knew she had dreamed many pleasant things, but she could recall none of them. Jahara had no aerodome, and Balthier had landed the ship a fair walk away out of what Bosch called common courtesy, and he insisted was nothing more than a precaution. Vaughan and Penello had gone bounding out into the grass, delighted to have the opportunity of travel, and the princess found their exuberance mildly reassuring, though not enough to beat back her inhibitions. The Garif were a proud people, engrossed in their ancient culture and religion to the point that many viewed them as unrefined and even ignorant. Unlike the Vieira, however, they did not forsake the ways of others, and welcomed Ashalia and her cortege to their lands. Penello wished to remain out in the plains, as the wild flowers scattered throughout enthralled her, and Vaughan opted to remain at her side, as he still feared losing track of her again. As she flitted about gathering blossoms, dropping them in Vaughan's lap and ordering him to sort them by color, the others continued onward to the center of Jahara, where upon mentioning the Nethysite, they were taken to the chief, who dwelled in a hut atop a hill at the northern end of the village. Balthier and Fran chose not to participate at this point, instead walking off to explore the surroundings while speaking in Vieiran, much to Ashalia's annoyance. She explained herself to the chief, Bosch remaining ever wary at her side, and he commended her bravery, speaking with great respect of Dalmasca and extending his gratitude toward her family for allowing them to go about their ways within Dalmascan borders free of interruption or conflict. The Arcadians, he said, had been developing plans to open a trading route across the plains, dividing the lands used by the ancient Garif in religious festivals and holy rites. The princess had never considered making allies out of the tribe, she had only ever heard her father speak of them in passing, describing them as peaceful and useful, the milk, meat, and pelts of their herds contributing to the main food supply of Dalmasca's lesser cities. This struck in her the odd thought that she had actually seen very little of her country, and even less of the world. None of the ways of the Garif had ever been purposefully hidden, save for their religious rites. In the chief's hut could be seen several tools of divine purpose, and throughout Jahara, and indeed all of the Osmone plains, stood shrines to deities of varying natures, but the chief had asked to be left in solitude with the Nethysite while he performed the proper rituals to summon forth his gods to appraise it, and Ash had obliged this request with polite if not uneasy adherence. They waited many hours, exploring the village and watching the sun slide slowly from its height. Yellow haze shielded the pastel blue of the sky overhead, the sun warming the air without casting a glare over the horizon. The plains radiated a vibrant green, and the distant mountains loomed miles and miles beyond, a soft purple barrier between the grass of the plains and the sand of the desert. Vaughan and Penello darted in clumsy circles on the grassy expanse, having never seen the extent of their country's variety, and Ash thought for a moment that she spied a slight glimmer of tears in Bosch's eyes as he watched them at her side. She soon recognized Penello as the focus of his attention, her light-hearted antics bringing a small smile to his face, but he did not allow himself to stare for long, and Ash decided against mentioning it. Searching her surroundings for some distraction, she overheard with deep surprise and deeper interest Balthier tell Fran that he found Dalmasca far pleasanter than Arcadia, though they quickly reverted to Vieiran upon realizing their proximity to the locals. The princess regretted her own preference for Dalmasca over Nubradia, for she was the direct heir of both thrones, but had come to understand that a home owed its relevance to its personal meaning, not to its politics or scenery or history. She had lived happily in Dalmasca, and for that it made her happy. She understood now the driving force behind people like Vaughan and Penello, to lose their home would be to lose a piece of their lives. Memories alone could not suffice. Looking briefly then to Bosch, her heart grew heavier still. Landis had been taken violently, divided between Arcadia and Rosaria, many of its citizens forced to swear fealty to the ruling crown or else be executed without trial. The selflessness with which Azelas had so often described him became evident to her, for Bosch fought not for vengeance, but to prevent such a fate from befalling others. Though she still hesitated to trust him, she suddenly felt as though she could not blame him for looking after her. He had failed his wife. He had failed her prince. A void had been left in his life that for the moment only she could fill, though she still resented her role as a replacement. But soon, she knew, Dalmasca would be restored to its former glory, and all would be right with the world. Though at first she had been wary of the stone, she now felt certain that it would be her salvation. She could hear it, the cry of the Nethysite's power, and yet fewer and fewer were the former whispers of the stone's menace. The tide, it seemed, had finally turned in Dalmasca's favor, and she at last began to consider her power with serious intent. As the sun at last sank behind the mountains, the tribe raised a fire at the center of the village, and prepared sleeping quarters for the princess, a coarse wooden hut consisting of 2 small rooms with animal hides spread upon the floors and a small fire in the back. She accepted it with gratitude, and over dinner she spoke with the tribal elders of their history and views of the war, finding that while they agreed with her cause, their people did not believe in violence, even for purposes of self-preservation. Though a part of her thought this philosophy of the purest ridiculousness, she did to some extent envy the Garif's ability to adhere to it with such honor and discipline. Never could she stand by while such injustices were exacted upon innocent people, and never could she come to accept them with peace in her heart. She wondered if perhaps this had been the train of thought that Azelas had come to follow, not necessarily the path of least resistance, but the path of least pain for her people. Indeed, she knew that they suffered along with her. But on this she felt certain that her people also held her thirst for justice, for freedom, and could not convince herself that surrender may be an adequate solution. Shortly, Vaughn and Penelo returned from the fields, and Penelo joyously offered the princess a circlet woven of pink blossoms, which she graciously, though hesitantly, accepted upon noticing the yellow crown that Penelo wore and the blue one that Fran inspected uncertainly in the distance. Vaughn and Penelo bombarded the elders with questions, but they didn't seem to mind, and in fact appeared to take great interest in explaining the nature of their way. But as night fell, the pastime grew old, and most of the village retired for the day. Before long, the plains had fallen silent, and the princess's cortege sat exhausted around the fire, wholly bored, but unable to sleep beneath the weight of such anticipation.
"What's taking so long?"
Vaughn groaned.
"Complaining won't make it go any faster,"
Balthier replied.
"You say that like he's actually going to listen,"
added Penelo.
"Hey!"
Vaughn exclaimed.
"I listen just fine."
Penelo smiled wryly.
"When you want to."
Now he laughed.
"Selective listening, I think Rex called it."
Penelo laughed as well.
"That was one of his names for it, at least." "Am I going to get an earful if I dare ask who Rex is?"
Balthier interjected on behalf of the others.
"He's our brother,"
Penelo obliged.
"Dear God,"
said Balthier.
"There are more of you."
They both hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances before Vaughn at last spoke up.
Not anymore." "Oh,"
Balthier replied.
"Right then." He means to apologize,
Fran added. Vaughn shrugged, though his difficulty in restraining his emotions remained clear.
It was a long time ago. I guess he did what he had to do. He didn't have to,
said Penelo.
He enlisted right at the end. I mean, he knew we couldn't win. Perhaps he just wanted to protect something,
Ash suggested.
How can he protect anything when he's dead?
Penelo replied with a sigh.
Was it different for Raslor? Did that make sense?
Ash turned her eyes to the fire sullenly.
It was expected of him. But what if it wasn't?
She pressed.
Didn't he have any reason? Penelo.
Vaughn injected a bit more harshly than he intended. She bit her lip, her eyes widening greatly, and began to apologize, but Ash shook her head, assuring her that it was all right.
Nubradia was his home,
Bosch said upon noting the princess's discomforted expression.
I'm sure that was reason enough, regardless of the circumstances. I think it was the same for Rex,
Vaughn added.
I never really paid attention to the war until after he died, and then it was just... I don't know. Hating the Empire, getting revenge. It's all I ever thought about, but I never did anything about it. I mean, I realized there was nothing I could do. It made me feel even more alone.
Ash nodded.
Hollow. Exactly, he replied. And Rex must be felt the same way. I mean, sure he's gone now, but at least he wasn't useless. I think that's why I followed you. You think?
Ash asked. He smiled slightly and ran a hand through his hair.
Well. Okay. I guess I'm pretty sure. But how does that make it any different?
Asked Penelo.
We're so small, against a whole country, I mean. The two of us joining the resistance doesn't make it any more powerful. The resistance was built by 2 people,
said Ash.
Every member joined alone. If they'd thought themselves too small to be of any use, there'd be no resistance at all. So hopeful all of a sudden,
Balthier mused.
Keep that up and we'll never accomplish anything.
The princess sneered, but said nothing, as the chief approached the fire in that moment, carrying with him the Nethysite.
My lady,
he said respectfully as she rose to her feet to greet him.
Done already?
She replied, garnering a muffled groan from Vaughn.
Unfortunately,
the chief answered, and then, upon receiving a look of sorrowful inquiry from Ash, he continued,
This Nethysite, you have used it? Yes,
she answered, and then quickly followed with,
It was not I who used it, though. Indeed, I had hoped you could show me how. You do not know the workings of the stone?
He asked. She shook her head, and he sighed dejectedly.
Then I fear we are no different. What?
Asked Ash.
In ages past,
he explained, shaking his head,
the gods made a gift of Nethysite to my people, but the manner of its use eluded us. Displeased by our failure, the gods took back their stones, and chose instead to give them to a human king. He used the Nethysite's power to bring peace to a troubled time. The Dynast king? It is a curious thing, though the blood of King Wraithwall flows through your veins, you cannot wield Nethysite. Cannot wield it?
She echoed distraughtly.
So then, am I to understand you can't tell me how?
He nodded and handed the nethicite back to her sorrowfully.
Though it shames me so to admit. Here before me stands a descendant of the dynast king himself. And I can accord her no help at all. Still, even if you knew how to use the nethicite, you would find it of small avail. The mist collected in the stone over ages past is lost, and with it the stone's power. It will be your posterity who wield this stone in ages yet to come. It is devoid of power, empty, yet full of thirst, a terrible longing to drink the world dry. The power of men and of gods, of good and of evil. It is often those who desire nethicite whom the nethicite itself desires.
At once Penelo's eyes brightened and she called out over the fire with glee,
"Monty! Penelo!"
She suddenly sprung across the circle, having seen before all others the young prince wandering weakly through the village gate, his eyes sunken and his posture unhealthily lax. Despite his appearance, though, he managed to find within him a hidden surge of energy and ran to meet her, crashing happily into her arms and squeezing her with pathetically lacking strength.
"How did you get all the way out here?"
she asked with a giggle, bending low and pulling him close.
"Long story," he replied shakily. "It's good to see you."
While the others bade the Garif chief farewell and cautiously started toward the two, Penelo couldn't help but note Monty's refusal to release her in a timely manner, and hesitantly voiced her concern.
"You're trembling."
He didn't reply, but only let his head drop on her shoulder for a moment.
"Monty, I can feel your ribs."
This, however, prompted him to abruptly push her away and gather his wits with expert speed.
"I'm all right. What, where's Balthier?"
Her brow furrowed at such behavior, but before she could respond, Balthier stepped up beside them and spoke in an unusually skeptical tone.
"You're not going to take off running this time, are you?" "Hopefully I won't have to,"
Monty answered, pulling a wrinkled envelope from within his vest and holding it out staunchly.
"Here, from Dr. Sid."
Balthier's glare intensified, but the prince remained undaunted.
"Trust me. You want to read it."
Another second of tension ensued, and at last Balthier snatched the letter harshly and strode back toward the fire with Fran at his heels. But the relief was cut short, for now Ash folded her arms and shot the boy an unforgiving glare.
"Are you traveling alone?"
she demanded coldly.
"Does it matter?"
he quipped in reply.
"To us, yes. Hasn't it occurred to you that contacting us could endanger you? Could endanger your father?" "My father's dead." Vane disbanded the Senate and took over.
Penelo was stricken with pity at the revelation, and cupped her hands over her mouth to keep from putting it to speech, but the reaction among the others was unified horror.
"What?"
asked Ash.
"When?" "6 days ago,"
Lamont continued with an eerily stony countenance.
"I know it's irresponsible of me, but I didn't know who else to come to." "Come to for what?" "I don't really know. Help, I guess. Dr. Sid smuggled me out of Arcadia, but they caught up to us in Rosaria." "You went to Rosaria?"
Bosch interjected concernedly.
"What were you thinking?" "I had to."
Lamont's tone was decidedly pleading, though he showed no sign of surrender.
"Rosaria's 13th prince has been in league with Dr. Sid for years. We needed him to represent his father's empire in peace talks."
He turned back to Ash desperately.
"He'll do it if you will." "Peace talks?"
The princess sneered.
He's agreed to meet with us in private at Baromises with the Grand Kiltias as mediator, if you're willing. This war can be stopped, but we have to work together. What war? The one you've been fighting all this time. You know Marquis Andor leads a group of insurgents, your pardon. He leads a large resistance force against Arcadia. Neither of our countries can afford this now. The Rosarian Empire would aid the resistance, use it as a pretext to declare war on Arcadia, and Vayne would have no choice but to answer. The Grand Kiltias may give you his blessing to rightly wear your crown and declare the restoration of your kingdom. As queen, you can call for peace with Vayne and stop Halim.
Ash had had enough. Monty was indeed among the sweetest of all children, but whatever horrors he had faced in tracking her down appeared to have stolen not only his naivete, but his logic and manners as well.
For peace?
She growled.
How dare you suggest such a thing? The Empire attacked us, stole all we hold dear, and you would have me save them from war. Dalmasca would be the battlefield.
Lamont argued.
What if Nethysite were used on Robinaster? You know my brother would do it.
He seemed to have more to say, but a sudden dizzy spell interrupted him, causing him to clench his eyes shut and hold his head, and then to teeter precariously toward Ash.
Are you all right?
She asked, foregoing talk of war and taking him by the shoulders to steady him. But he would have no pity and backed away with a quick recovery.
I'm sorry if I presumed too much, but please understand, I just don't want anyone to get hurt. I'm sick of violence. If you can't trust me, then... well, take me hostage. Vayne will have to listen.
Disregarding his somewhat forced display of maturity, the princess crouched down and easily overpowered him, pulling him forward and managing to briefly press the back of her hand to his forehead before he slipped out of her grasp.
You've got a fever. It's nothing.
He defended.
I'm fine.
Ash just stood, uninterested in negotiating with an ill and desperate child.
What happened after they caught you in Rosaria? What does that have to do with anything? He ditched you, didn't he?
Balthier interrupted, dropping Sid's letter into the fire and rejoining the group.
Couldn't risk losing funds for his research. He's our only safe link to Vayne,
Monty replied.
I couldn't blow his cover. And you've been on your own since then?
Penelo asked frightfully.
I can handle myself. I'm a solitaire, remember?
Balthier rolled his eyes.
You're a 10-year-old boy who hasn't eaten in 6 days. Come on.
He seized him by the collar and began dragging him toward the hut.
We're getting you cleaned up whether you like it or not.
Monty put up quite a fussy protest, but was no match for the Sky Pirate's grip. The others attempted to intervene, but Fran posted herself at the door and reassured them.
You can trust him. What?
Asked Penelo.
Balthier is Arcadian,
Fran explained.
His prince is without judges to protect him.
Vaughn shook his head.
But last time. Besides, Master Lamont is no longer loyal to a corrupt house. We don't know that for certain,
said Bosch.
What?
Penelo replied disbelievingly.
The mere fact that he is young,
the captain explained,
should not determine how deeply we trust him. Don't be ridiculous,
cried Penelo.
He's a frightened little boy trying to save his brother. Trying to save him.
said Ash.
I'm not so sure. He said Sid is our only safe link to Vayne. What do you suppose that means? I don't mean to sound insensitive or anything,
Vaughn added,
but if I was Vayne, I'd off him like that.
He snapped his fingers carelessly, causing Penelo to wrinkle her nose in disgust.
Why would he want to kill him?
She demanded.
He can't run a country. Maybe not yet,
Bosch answered.
As long as Lamont is alive,
Ash explained,
he's a threat to Vayne's throne. The people will demand a switch at the first sign of disappointment. And with the situation between Arcadia and Rosaria what it is,
Bosch continued,
Vayne is likely to disappoint, regardless of his actions or inactions. With Lamont in charge, the Senate will be reformed and they will run Arcadia's affairs.
Penelo's shoulders drooped in defeat.
And any mistakes they make will be considered their own fault, not his. Exactly. There's just no bright side, is there? We're not looking at this from all perspectives,
Ash went on gently.
Vayne and Lamont are brothers, and they're very close, aren't they? Suppose they're manipulating us together. Wouldn't this be the perfect way to gain our trust? Oh, come on!
Cried Penelo.
Monty's not like that. He hardly even knows how to lie.
Bosch cocked his head thoughtfully.
But he's not above bending the rules when he thinks it's important enough, we saw that firsthand in Bujerba. That was different. He's got a point, Penelo,
said Vaughn.
If Vayne convinced him this was for everybody's own good, he'd do it. He may not even know what it is that he's doing,
added Ash.
He may truly think there will be negotiations, we don't know this Dr. Sid very well.
Penelo looked distraught, and resignedly turned to Fran in hopes of a different opinion.
Fran? You're good at sensing these things. I believe the boy is honest. No offense, Fran,
Vaughn said hesitantly,
but this is a pretty big risk to take based on one of your feelings. No feeling,
she said.
See for yourself.
She stepped away from the hut's door and gestured to a crack in its jamb, which they gathered around with silent curiosity. However, even without a full view of the situation, as their voices ceased, they all perceived what Fran's sensitive ears had been tuned to all along: Lamont was crying. It was a hushed sound, no sobbing or wailing, as is the custom of most children, but rather gasping, as though the boy was out of breath, accompanied by only a few sniffles now and then. Through the crack, they glimpsed him by the fire in the back room, its door slightly open, crouched on the floor with his face buried despairingly in Balthier's chest. And Balthier, uneasy but obedient to his cause, simply held the shuddering child, stroking his hair and whispering to him that everything would be all right. They left for Bouromysès the next morning.